tonight, of course, is the question of escaping from Thucydides' trap. How we deal with and handle successfully the problem of rivalry and war, the potential for it between the United States and China. And I know everybody knows that Thucydides' trap is that rising power is destined to collide with an existing power. And all of you remember Professor Mersheimer speaking here before the council 2 years ago, in which he said exactly that a status quo power, an existing power like the United States, would be most reluctant to accept the rise of a power such as China. The Mersheimer view is at one end of the spectrum. Another end is, of course, that there are things we can do about it to avoid it, which is Dr. O'Hanlon's thrust in his presentation this evening. Many of you have heard Dr. O'Hanlon before. You've probably heard him, I was going to say you've heard him at the council, but you may have heard him on one of his 3,000 or so presentations on radio and television, the numerous articles he's written. You may have read several of his books, of which there are numerous. They cover a wide range of subjects, but they fundamentally focus upon defense matters and American foreign policy. But they've been based on, have included insightful presentations on Korea, of course on Afghanistan and South Asia in general, and on Asia in general. The presentation tonight, obviously, is on China and our policies in the Far East. Dr. O'Hanlon holds his master, interestingly, his bachelor's degree and one of his master's degrees are in the physical sciences, physics. And I noted in something the other day that as a student at Princeton, he was part of a team building a solar telescope, and one of the professors was going to try to verify or not Einstein's theory of relativity. So he spent time thinking about those kinds of things. And then he got his master's, a master's degree, a second master's degree, and a PhD in international relations, the latter from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, where he was a classmate of General Petraeus, who remains a good friend to this day. He's taught at Johns Hopkins SAIS as an adjunct professor. He's a visiting lecturer at Princeton, among his several activities. He's one of the most, if you were to keep up with what he's written and commented on and his blogging, it would probably be a full-time task. The only mystery is then how does he create all of that? The tremendous energy. And I have to mention one other thing. He's a tennis player. And while at Princeton doing these other things, he was an assistant coach of the women's tennis team. With that comment, it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael O'Hanlon.
Thank you, Frank. I just wanted the introduction to go on, or this guy's sense of humor. You know, this is a real treat to be here. Thank you very much. One thing I learned in tennis, it was an old saying of Peter Fleming, and you all know who he played doubles with. And somebody asked him, what's the key to playing good doubles? And he said, real easy, have John McEnroe as your partner. So I took that advice to heart in this book, and like in some of my other books. And if you're going to write about the United States and China, who do you team with? Former Deputy Secretary of State Steinberg, who had spent much of the previous years negotiating with the Chinese over all these disputed islands and the Senkaku, Diaoyus, and the Scarborough Shoal, and all the other problems that are out there in the Western Pacific. And I think Jim recognized that this is a real problem. And so you mentioned John Mearsheimer, and John, of course, does say that we are in this structural, almost predetermined path towards rivalry with China. And Jim and I aren't quite the opposite extreme because, although I'm glad you teed it up that way, because it allows me to sort of lay this out. The other extreme would be, I say, or would argue, the group of folks that basically say, listen, it's 2014, it's not 1914. mankind isn't that stupid anymore. We're not gonna let ourselves go to war. Bear with me for a minute. Just setting up the argument, the straw man. Mankind isn't dumb enough to do that again. We saw what happened in Europe in 1914. We saw how people puffed out their chest and got all nationalistic and worried about how the slightest insult to their personal or national honor would be unacceptable and therefore faced each other down. We saw how these military machines geared up with things like the Schlieffen Plan, so that once they started to get ready for combat, it almost became inevitable that they would wind up in large-scale war because they didn't really know how to back down gracefully. We learned from all that. We learned also that nuclear weapons, which are now on the scene, should provide some level of deterrence. And plus, we trade with the Chinese so much, and we know them. We interact with them at a human-to-human level. So for all these reasons, there's just no way that war could be possible in this more enlightened day of the early 21st century. Jim and I don't buy that either, just for the record. Just to be clear, that would be the other poll from Mearsheimer, the poll that basically says globalization, nuclear deterrence, and maybe the advancement and enlightenment of our species somehow make war unlikely or impossible. We don't go that far. We actually see how this could happen. And just to give you one example of how this, and by which I mean intense rivalry, arms racing, or even conflict, could happen. As you know, the United States and China don't have any specific pieces of land that we both claim. We don't have any specific issues over which we would directly contest each other, but we do have a lot of allies that do have some of those kinds of overlapping claims and disputes with China, and a lot of historical baggage. And we have a pretty strong commitment to those allies. And I'm going to work through that argument in just a second as to why I think we should sustain that. So that's how we could get drawn in. And plus, Mearsheimer's right. It's hard for an established power and a rising power to get along. It may not be impossible, and I think in the end, Mearsheimer's a bit too fatalistic, but he's certainly right to sound the trumpet of alarm. And so Jim and I went into this thinking, conflict may not be predetermined, but neither is peace. And again, he had come out of this portfolio at the State Department where he had to worry about 190 countries, but he also had a particular interest in East Asia and spent a lot of time on that. As you know, the Obama administration ultimately created this policy called the rebalance, or the pivot, where they decided the Asia Pacific was important enough and neglected enough in the recent period of our war on terrorism that we should reinvigorate that effort, that focus. And Jim was part of the team that ultimately agreed to that, implemented that. He was leaving in the summer of 2011 as that policy was really being teed up for the first time. And as you may recall, it was Hillary in an article that fall, and then President Obama in a trip later that same fall of 2011 to Australia and elsewhere that really announced the policy of the rebalance. But it was set in motion earlier, and partly for the reasons that Jim was facing and contending with. So I could tell you a lot of scary stories. I can't do it like Tom Clancy, but I could tell you a lot of scary stories, and I'm sure a lot of you are already well aware of the specific kinds of conflicts that exist between the United States as well as its allies in the region on the one hand and China on the other. But just to give you a quick couple of examples, you all know that Taiwan is still a disputed issue. And we have not been hearing a lot about Taiwan in recent years because President Ma, the president of Taiwan, is a guy who wants to see if he can't get along with the Chinese. So he's facilitated a lot of cross-strait economic interaction, and he hasn't tried to raise these symbolic issues where Taiwan might pursue something like independence or something in that direction, which is what his predecessors had done, and what China, of course, will not tolerate. So there were some very acute crises in the 1990s and then the George W. Bush years, in the early George W. Bush years, because China wasn't willing to tolerate any movement towards independence or even greater autonomy by Taiwan. Taiwan wanted to sort of roil the waters a little and see how far they could push it, and you got major crises and even some missile firings and other such things. Well, we haven't seen that in the last few years under President Ma, but I don't know how many of you follow Taiwanese politics very closely. President Ma's popularity right now is about 9%. He's less popular in Taiwan than we are in Pakistan. And that's saying something. And so he's not going to be voted out of office or impeached, but his term ends in 2 years. And he's from the party in Taiwan that is more conciliatory, just like he himself has been, towards China. What if this low popularity drags down his party and the so-called DPP wins again in 2016? Then where are things going to go? Well, I don't know. I'm not going to lambaste the DPP, and I hope that they will have a way to assert some of their agenda, which is not just about independence and China. It's got a lot of other things, and hopefully they have moderated and can move in a direction that's less sort of provocative in that context. But I don't know. So there's one way in which the whole situation could change. And by the way, if there's a crisis over Taiwan in 2017 or 18, China at that point will have something like a $300 billion a year military budget, or at least approaching that. The last time we had big crises with China, you know what their military budgets were in 96 and then in 2001 and 2 and 3? Less than 100 billion. So at some point, people start to feel their oats. That's sort of the Thucydides argument. It's sort of the Mearsheimer argument. And so China's going to be in this position where it may be a little bit less inclined to let the Americans sail a couple of aircraft carriers into the waters near their coast, 8,000 miles away from the mainland US, 18 miles away from mainland China, and sort of settle the thing that way. It's not clear China's always going to be willing to play by those rules. Another example, we all follow the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, right? And 5 uninhabited pieces of rock in the East China Sea. And both Japan and China can make beautiful arguments about why they are Japanese or Chinese. And we sort of took we had one of these roles in this whole issue, which is almost the worst kind of role you can play. We sort of took one side, but not really. So after World War II, we sort of gave them to Japan, but we didn't take a position as to whose they really should be long term. And so the US position is that we don't have a position on whether they are sovereign territory of Japan or China. But at the moment, we acknowledge and support and will defend by military force if need be Japan's right to administer the islands, even though we don't recognize that Japan necessarily owns the island. Well, I don't know about you, but this is the kind of language that makes me nervous. In the context of East Asia, it makes me think a little bit about our old friend Dean Acheson in 1950 in Korea, where the US said, well, we don't really have to protect South Korea, it's not really crucial. And then we thought that up until the point where North Korea attacked South Korea, perhaps feeling invited to do so by Acheson's comment, and then we changed our mind because we decided after the fact that this kind of brazen aggression could not be tolerated. Well, I'm not going to liken the Chinese to the North Koreans, but you still have some of the same ambiguities and potential, therefore, for the failure of deterrence. So when President Obama was in East Asia last week, he reiterated that the US is firmly committed to uphold its treaty obligations towards Japan, including over the Senkaku Islands. But what does that actually mean? And if we wake up one day and the Chinese overnight have parachuted in 100 Chinese soldiers onto one of the Senkaku Islands, what do we do? Some people would say, a Marine general a few weeks ago said publicly, we should take it back. Well, with all due respect to that Marine general, and he wasn't necessarily wrong to voice the option, but that means killing people, killing Chinese, unless you've got some really good tear gas or something, and you're pretty confident that's going to be the antidote that will allow them to be persuaded to surrender. Maybe you move in with 5,000 Marines and they decide not to oppose you. But remember, we're playing a long-term game with China. And even if that happened and was successful in the short term, what would China's medium-term reaction be? Are they going to happily say, okay, the Americans just landed 5,000 Marines on this little spit of land, a couple hundred miles from our coast, contested by our arch-rival and arch-nemesis Japan. Okay, that's okay, I guess we lost. We'll just accept defeat. Is that really what they're going to say? I don't think so. I think what they're going to say is, what's the way that we can be in a better position the next time around there's a crisis? So the stakes here are high. And by the way, if we do use lethal force against those hypothetical Chinese occupiers, and then the Chinese fight back, this is the kind of potential for an escalatory dynamic that can lead you to real conflict, because the initial skirmish seems so small and limited that it may give people a false sense of security. They can somehow resolve that issue, just like Austria-Hungary thought it could resolve the assassination of the Archduke of Sarajevo or what have you, or Archduke of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo 100 years ago, and then you got World War I out of it. I do think people are a little bit more historically informed than our predecessors 100 years ago, who didn't really appreciate what modern industrial might could do on the battlefield. At least we have the knowledge of the world wars to inform us that if a conflict begins, we better do everything we can to stop it. But beyond that, I'm not really convinced that we can just rest on these laurels or on this confidence that we're a more enlightened, more informed, wiser version of the Homo sapien species in this era than they were then. And so I'm nervous about what happens when an established power sees a rising power, as Thucydides wrote about. Okay, so what do you do? I would lay out three hypothetical ideas, and of course I'm going to wind up endorsing the third, so you're going to have to play along with me just for a second, but I'll be brief and try to get to the idea. I want to get to this basic idea, which is the idea that Jim Steinberg and I write about in our book, which is called Strategic Reassurance and Resolve, U.S.-China Relations in the 21st Century. And it's reassurance plus resolve that we consider the cornerstone of our strategy. And it's not totally a different approach from what the United States has done for decades, but it's for a new era in which China is now a budding superpower in its own right. And we're actually recommending this strategy not just to Washington, but also to Beijing. So that's what I want to try to sketch out for you, the basic idea behind it, and then a couple examples of where it would lead you in policy terms if you accept the overall theoretical logic behind it. But before I get to that third approach, let me mention two other logical ideas that you may have had on your mind. I don't know what Professor Mearsheimer would have said, but there are certain American scholars who would advocate one or the other of these first two options. And let me therefore walk through them. And just to give you a sense of where I'm headed, the first one you might call, if you're going to be crass, abandonment of allies or abandonment of East Asia by the United States. A more polite way to put it might be retrenchment. Let's sort of circle the wagons back closer to home. Let's not worry about defending the entire world. Let's try to defend the allies that we most need to defend. And unfortunately for our Japanese, Korean, Taiwanese, Filipino, Australian friends, this is no longer a part of the world that we're really in a position to underwrite with our military force, and they're going to have to be more on their own. So I'll talk that through in a minute, and I do not endorse it, just to be clear, but you might call it abandonment or appeasement of China if you're trying to, abandonment of allies, appeasement of China. If you want to be harsh and blunt, you might call it retrenchment if you're trying to be more polite and try to dress it up in a little bit, more acceptable theoretical or logical construct. Option two, I might call outcompete China. And the idea here, this harkens back to Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, when we had a Cold War rival in the Soviet Union that was very, very impressive in some ways, not in all ways, and we learned later just how unimpressive they were, even among their own thinkers. And of course, the foundations of Soviet power were eroding through much of the period that we were becoming increasingly fearful of them. But in terms of ICBMs and nuclear weapons and tanks and everything else, they were a pretty serious peer, pretty serious rival. And then Reagan came on the scene, and he basically said, nah, we can lick them. And of course, he didn't necessarily expect, even in his best dreams, that we were going to lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union by the end of the 1980s. And obviously, we can all have the historical argument about how much Reagan and the United States deserve the credit for that and how much it was internal Soviet weakness that inevitably led to that, or some combination thereof. But you could say, whatever, it worked, right? And let's try it again. Let's now try to compete head-to-head with China, instead of talking ourselves into the doom and gloom that the 21st century is going to be theirs because they're rising fast and we feel like we're sort of in decline. By the way, there are elements of this second scenario that I do agree with, elements of the second approach, but I'll explain in a second why I don't think it's adequate. And then the third one, the one that is in the book that Jim and I write about, strategic reassurance and resolve, this basically says both countries are going to defend their core interests. Let's just accept that as a premise. For two American scholars, one of them former Deputy Secretary of State, we consider this a good thing. We think the United States should stay resolute in defense of its allies and interests overseas. And again, I'll get to that in a second. But for the Chinese, we also accept that they are going to do certain things that are resolute, whether we like it or not. Partly because they went through that period from about the early 1800s, 1839, until the Japanese invasion a century later, in which they felt vulnerable and walked all over by the outside world. They call it the century of humiliation, and if there's one thing we're confident about, they're not going to go there again. If there's one thing that China's rise and Chinese power is going to enable leadership in Beijing to do, it's to never again have a century of humiliation, and they will fight to prevent that. So they're going to be resolute as well. Now, we can try to talk them out of being quite as resolute in regard to Taiwan, perhaps. That's going to be quite a chore. We can try to challenge them on some of these issues, but the bottom line is they're going to be resolute about defining their own security in ways that we can't talk them out of in the core essence of territorial integrity and a strong military, and trying to be the first among equals among the Asian powers in the future. So the resoluteness is sort of there. It's going to be a real part of the landscape. But at the same time the two sides are resolute, they're going to have to look for ways to reassure each other. They're going to have to look for ways to manage their competition. It is a competition. It's going to remain a competition. We're not going to strategically trust each other. We're not going to be strategic friends in a military sense for the foreseeable future. But that's okay. We can still find a way to bound the military competition to avoid the most dangerous aspects. And that's what our concept is all about. But again, let me get to that logic by first trying to identify, explain, and demolish the first two approaches that you might think are the logical alternatives. So abandonment or appeasement. Well, I'm sure I'm already making half of you have your blood curdle inside of you to propose that this could even be in a serious discussion about American foreign policy. We Americans don't like to think of ourselves as people who run away from our commitments or our friends. And that by itself is a reason enough why it probably shouldn't happen and won't happen. We're not going to sell out the Japanese, the Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Filipinos, or even some fraction of that group. And I don't think we should. Partly because it would make me ashamed to be an American if we did that. But there's also, apart from reasons of pride and patriotism and morality, there's also a very strong strategic reason not to consider this idea of abandonment or retrenchment, which is once you start that process, where does it really end? So for example, if we just decide China's rising too fast and we just can't keep up, because the problem is that all these allies of ours are right next to China. So China gets to play on its home field in any kind of military confrontation that might ensue over the disputed Senkaku Islands or over Japan or what have you. And we're far away. And therefore, we can't really hold our own over time against China. Well, if we take that attitude for the Far East, and we take this treaty ally, Japan, a country that we went through the Cold War with and won the Cold War together, a country that has accepted a constitution forswearing the use of offensive military power, that has kept its military budget sometimes lower than we would like, but it's at least reassured its neighbors, that has foregone the possibility of nuclear weapons, that has behaved, frankly, beautifully since 1945 on the international stage by almost any measure that I would care to identify. And it was because of the US-Japan relationship that all that was possible. And then we're going to end that. Where does that leave Japan? Where does Japan go? What kind of military buildup? What kind of nuclear weapons program? What kind of more offensive or more aggressive behavior in the region do we see Japan contemplate? Partly because it feels that now that it's abandoned, it's going to have to be more assertive because the best defense is a good offense. In other words, this would sort of ignore the 70 years of successful history that we've had by the United States leading this global alliance system. But leave aside Japan or Korea or the Philippines. If we did this in the Far East, what's Saudi Arabia going to think? What are the Israelis going to think? What are the Turks going to think? What are the Emiratis going to think about when we're going to pull the plug on them the minute it gets inconvenient or a little too hard? And as soon as they start to doubt our commitment to their security, they're going to start building nuclear weapons. They've watched Iran rise and also pursue its own nuclear program. They're all very worried about Iran. And so if we start to be seen as a superpower that abandons its allies when it gets convenient for us, we're going to unravel the whole logic of the entire post-World War II order that has produced the most stable period in human history and the most prosperous. So I think it's just a really bad way to think. Or to put it differently, there was the old British statesman, you'll recall the phrase he used to say 100 years ago, nations don't have permanent friends, they have permanent interests. I think that guy could not have been more wrong, because the logic of what he said is what led to World War I. Everybody was wondering, do I stand by this ally or not? Should I take this side or that side in the fight? How do I maximize my own national power 5 and 10 and 20 years out? That logic doesn't work. That logic gives you World War I. The only way you have a logic that sustains an alliance over time is to stay steadfast by your allies that share common values with you. So option one's a terrible option. We can't abandon our allies just because it's gotten a little bit more difficult to defend them. And again, if you want to challenge me on any of this in the discussion, I'm more than happy to go back to it. But let me not belabor the point. Let me now go to option two, because option two is a little more interesting. And option two basically has a lot going for it. It basically says, listen, let's outcompete the Chinese. Let's not decide that they're going to be able to threaten all of our allies in the region. We can outcompete them. And by the way, there's a lot to be said for option two, not just because it's appealing to those of us who, want to always think America's number one and remember fondly the Reagan years and remember how we won the Cold War and all of that. But even if you just look at the statistics and the facts, there's something to be said for option two. We still outspend China on our respective military forces by about 4 to 1. 600 billion for us, about 150 to 175 billion for them. But it doesn't stop there. Our allies collectively spend another 400 billion to 500 billion a year on their militaries. And admittedly, they don't always spend it the way we would like. They're not always willing to use it in support of missions that we undertake. But we still have by far the best allies in the world. Or to put it even more starkly, there has never been a global alliance like this in the history of mankind, especially in the absence of a clear threat. So we've got about 60 countries in Europe, in East Asia, in the Middle East, and Latin America that are either formally or very close to formally allied with the United States, that do military planning together. And the combined military budgets of these 60 nations is more than $1 trillion a year. It's more than 2/3 of the world total. We are unified through a system of alliances. And part of why it works is because we don't insist that people always fight with us in any given war. If they don't want to go to Iraq and they think George W. Bush made a mistake, like half the Americans think George W. Bush made a mistake, we don't try to coerce our allies into fighting that war with us. We may try to talk them into it, but we do it in a democratic, transparent way. They can see that we're disagreeing amongst ourselves about that war, and they recognize that as long as they're with us when the going really gets tough, when our core security is threatened, when any member of this alliance system's core security is directly put at risk, as long as we agree on that, then we can disagree on some of these other issues and then put it behind us. It was George W. Bush and Chancellor Schroeder who had the big fight about the Iraq War. Now it's Obama and Merkel, and they're going to meet tomorrow. I guess Chancellor Merkel is arriving in the US tonight. And they're not going to have to revisit those fights because we've learned as an alliance how to put those things behind us. And because it's two different leaders. Democracies change leaders. So we've got this strength. We've got $1 trillion in combined military spending in the Western alliance system. We also have about 2/3 of world GDP in the Western alliance system. So sure, it's easy to look at a graph. If somebody takes China's GDP, its gross domestic product, and charts it out and then extrapolates to what it might be in 2020 or 2030, it's very easy to get scared, right? I'm sure you've all seen these graphs. And at some point, they show China exceeding us in the size of its economy. And in fact, China already does outdo us in manufacturing, value added for manufacturing. But here's the thing. First of all, China's economy is going to slow down. It's not going to slow down to the point where, it's in 2 and 3% annual growth rate. It's going to do better than that. But it's going to slow down for a lot of reasons we can get into if you wish. Secondly, we still have those allies. And they are the powerhouse of the global economy along with us. And yes, China's bending more steel than anybody. But is that ultimately what it's really all about? I'm not saying that we're in an era where bending steel doesn't matter at all. But to give you some examples, some of the other really good steel benders out there are Japan, Korea, Germany, and the United States. So matched up against any one of those individually, China looks pretty good. But to the extent that we maintain this cohesion as a community, our position is quite strong. To the point where I saw a nice extrapolation by the Carnegie Endowment recently, in which they said, what's the world going to look like in 2050? In 2050, China is still going to have about 1.4 billion people. They will not have grown in the meantime because, of course, they had the one-child policy for so long, and that slowed down their growth. And their GDP will keep growing, and their per capita income will keep improving. But right now, their per capita income is something like 1/10 of ours. Did you know that? 1/10 of ours. And by 2050, maybe it'll be a third of ours. Well, you might say, okay, China against the US, they've got 4 times as many people, and now we're only going to have 3 times of an advantage in per capita wealth, so they will exceed us in their overall GDP. Well, that's true. By 2050, China will probably have a somewhat larger economy than the United States. But what about Western Europe? What about Japan, Canada, Australia, Korea? These countries are all our allies. And as long as we stick together, our overall position is going to match up very well. So the same Carnegie Endowment study that projected China having 1.4 billion with an average per capita wealth of about $30,000 a year, per capita income of $30,000 a year, it said the Western world is going to have 1 billion people with an average per capita income of about $70,000 to $80,000 a year. So we're still going to be, collectively, at least twice as rich as they are at that point. And I could go down the list of our advantages. Let me just tick off a couple very quickly, because I ultimately don't want to make you believe fully in option 2, so I don't want to get too enthusiastic here. But you know, this whole debate about American decline, I think, is mostly off base, and America's strengths are still very impressive, even though we have some big national problems we have to get after as well. But if you look at our overall innovation, we still have by far the world's biggest research and development spending in this country. We are still the #1 incubator of innovation. We're still the place where, no matter where they were born, the founders of Yahoo and Google want to come, because this is the best place to do business on the planet. It's got the most free and open society, transparent business environment. I've even woven into this talk, by the way, a defense of lawyers. Most people make jokes about lawyers. I'm going to actually say a good thing about lawyers. Lawyers help make our economy strong because they protect the sense of rule of law. If you come in and you invest in the United States, if you have property in the United States, if you have intellectual property in the United States, you can protect it, which means that's one of the reasons, along with the size of our market, the wealth of our population, the communication systems we have here, why people still want to come here to form their businesses, to do their entrepreneurship. So we have amazing advantages that China is just beginning to wish that it could someday begin to approach. And so there's no reason for us to capitulate. And I basically agree with people who make that argument. But now let's be careful about going too far with the logic. Because if you now say, okay, let's just try to outcompete the Chinese the way we outcompeted the Soviets. The Chinese have a much healthier economy than the Soviets did. They still have been growing at 8% a year. They are now, by 8 to 1, outproducing us in steel. By 2 to 1, outproducing us in vehicles. By 2.6 trillion to 2 trillion, outproducing us in total value added of manufacturers. We're the #2 manufacturing power in the world still. But China's now about 25% ahead of us in overall value added. Now, the good news is we produce things like airplanes and pharmaceuticals and other advanced technologies. And the Chinese bend a lot of metal and produce the computers that we design here or that the Taiwanese design. And so the overall structure of the international economy is not so unfavorable to us. But the Chinese have gotten pretty darn good. And they're going to be able to produce weapons, vehicles, ships, planes, rockets, and hold their own against us very nicely. So we're not in a position where we can just outspend them into the ground. By the way, they're spending 2% of their GDP on their military right now, and we're spending about 3.5%. So to have that 600 billion to 150 billion advantage that I talked about earlier, we're working harder to do it. They're not having to work that hard. And they still have far and away the second biggest military budget in the world, which is doubling roughly every 8 to 10 years. So if you really want to push this argument too far to say that we can defeat those Chinese, that's not so easy. And there's one more piece of it that makes it hard, which is the nature of technology itself. So we've gotten used to, as Americans, we've gotten used to essentially being able to treat the Pacific Ocean as an American lake ever since World War II. That we have, of course, the Soviets complicated life in the Cold War for certain kinds of operations, but when it came to be head-to-head US-China time, we could go up to Chinese shores. We could be as close to China as you and I are right now to the eastern shore of Maryland, or certainly to the Bay Bridge. And we could sail up in that distance and be safe and be confident that if anybody got into a fight, we would prevail. I mean, it's amazing. We were 8,000 miles from home. We're within eyesight of their shores, and we had the advantageous military position. That's not natural. And that's not going to survive in the era of precision long-range strike weapons, of which China's now building a lot. I'm not suggesting China can beat us militarily, but I am suggesting the idea of Americans being able to operate with impunity within eyesight of Chinese shores, that era is over, and it's not coming back. Because you would have to have an incredible advantage in military spending and technology in order to recreate something that was so unnatural as that. So the idea that we're just going to be able to have such a military superiority that it harkens back to the good old days of the 60s and 70s when we were ruling the Pacific and the Chinese just had to accept whatever we did in the oceans. They could give us a hard time on land in Korea and indirectly in Vietnam, but in the oceans, we sort of carried the day. I think those periods of time are gone. So Jim and I still want to maintain American military superiority as long as we can, but we don't think it's an adequate strategy just to hang your hat exclusively on that. And one more problem with it, which is, remember I was talking a lot about the strength of our allies as really, in a way, our ace in our hand. That was, or our trump card, because the Chinese might be able to catch up to us a bit, but they're never going to have allies like we do. They've got North Korea. We've got South Korea and Japan and Australia and Canada, and I could go down the list, and most of Europe. And if the going really gets tough, India's probably going to be with us, not against us, if China gets too aggressive. So all that's good, but that hinges on the world believing that we are a dependable, level-headed, non-belligerent power. And the good news is we have history on our side, because that's how they tend to think about us in most periods of time. And even when a lot of people got angry about George W. Bush and thought that he was too assertive and too willing to use force, first of all, there was a case for what Bush did, whether I didn't vote for him, but he overthrew Saddam Hussein. It wasn't the worst thing somebody ever did in the world to overthrow such a brutal dictator. But secondly, the point is that you could sort of see our democratic debate working, and you could see how Americans pushed back against that, and it wasn't likely to happen again. So in that regard, the United States has a visibility, a transparency into its decision-making that I think is reassuring to our friends and allies, but not if we get, or are perceived as getting, aggressive. So if we just try to outcompete China, and anytime there's a fracas or a skirmish or a brouhaha or any kind of closing of the gap militarily, our instinct is just to try to outcompete. I'm not sure every country is going to like that. I'm not sure every country is going to think we're working hard enough to be conciliatory, and the cohesion of our alliance system may start to come apart a little bit. It may fray. And then, if we lose some of our allies, China's position may not be quite so unfavorable matched up against us. So Jim and I feel like you got to have a philosophy that blends a commitment to strategic resolve and strength with an effort at reassurance. So you may think I've now worked very hard already a number of minutes into this presentation, which I'm going to have to begin to draw to a close so we have time for discussion, worked very hard to prove the obvious, which is that you better not just pull back from Asia, and you better not think you can just outspend China forever. You need something a little more nuanced and complicated. Well, unfortunately, I had to spend that time proving the obvious, or what maybe some people would consider obvious, because there is a rich debate that the John Mearsheimers of the world are rightly raising about just how do we deal with this incredibly important shift in international power, the rise of China. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about some of the examples of what Jim and I would propose. I've already laid out to you the basic philosophy of strategic reassurance and resolve. Stay committed to your allies. If you're the United States, stay committed to military superiority for as long as you can hold on to it. But also look for ways to take an edge off the military competition, to reduce the chances of conflict, to build up greater and better working relationships across military lines between China and the United States, to anticipate scenarios or events that could be dangerous and try to reduce their likelihood. That's what we're talking about. And so we work through in the book, we have 20 recommendations. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through anything close to the list tonight. But what I will say is, part of why we have 20 is because we can never find the perfect one. There is no silver bullet. There is no solution that says if only the United States would have 8 aircraft carriers instead of 10, or 20 instead of 10, or whatever, that the world would be peaceful and this relationship would be solved. We think it's inevitable, to some extent, like Mearsheimer said, that this will be a difficult relationship and a competitive one for a long time. But we also think there are ways to prevent it from descending down that slippery slope towards conflict. So, a couple of examples. Arms control. You have to be careful about arms control. We all know it doesn't always deliver what it promises, and sometimes it gets you into trouble. You sign a treaty with somebody, then they start to cheat on it, or you think they're cheating, or there's some loophole in the treaty they try to exploit, and this arms control treaty that was supposed to bring us peace and better cooperation and greater trust winds up being a source of acrimony and debate and disagreement. We saw that a lot with the Soviets. And sometimes if you try to limit the wrong things in arms control, it's sort of like squeezing a balloon. You close off a certain aspect of military competition, but you just redirect it into potentially a more dangerous area. We saw that with the Washington Naval Treaty in the 1920s. People tried to limit surface combatants, didn't do much about submarines or aircraft carriers at the time where they were becoming the more important naval assets, arguably. And so Jim and I don't try to overdo the arms control, but we do see some opportunities. And I'll give you one example. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is incidents at sea. So in the Soviet Union heyday, the United States and the Soviet Union negotiated some ideas on how we should operate near each other's naval forces. Of course, we were constantly spying on each other, and that's inevitable. And you're not going to be able to change that. But what you can do is at least spy safely, almost, you might say, gentlemanly way. And with aircraft carriers involved, one of the things that means is don't get in the way of each other's aircraft carrier when they're doing flight operations. Because I'm sure, so close to Annapolis, we've probably got some experienced sailors and maybe even some aviators in the room, and they could explain better than I that when an aircraft carrier is conducting flight operations, it's a very, very finely calibrated and delicate thing. And it only works to the extent that you have very good pilots, very good people on deck, and also that you're maintaining a speed of transit by the aircraft carrier that creates wind that essentially naturally increases the effective airspeed of that plane as it's taking off. And so the carrier's own motion becomes part of what gives the aircraft the necessary wind speed, or speed measured relative to the still air, to take off. So you don't want somebody's submarine to impede your motion when you're doing flight operations on a carrier. It's not safe. So things like that we would regulate with the Soviets. And we would say, okay, we're going to keep spying on each other. We'll spy on you. You'll spy on us. We get it. But let's at least not knock into each other's ships or send each other's jets plummeting into the ocean because the carrier had to divert to avoid a collision. And we sort of figured out some rules of the road. We don't have that with the Chinese right now. The Chinese have been a little reluctant. We've been a little reluctant. Jim and I sketch out some ideas for why we think that would be a good idea. And maybe it's easier if you do it as part of a package. That's part of the advantage of having 20 ideas. Even if we don't convince Beijing and Washington to do all 20, if we convince them to do 10, some of those ideas will appeal more to Washington, some will appeal more to Beijing, but the package hopefully is something they can agree on in general. Another example, one of my favorite Americans, and still an amazing scholar, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who of course in the news these days is a bit of a hawk in dealing with Russia over the Ukraine crisis. But his last book, Strategic Vision, was not quite so hawkish in what he said about China. And he actually said, you know what, we're probably doing too much reconnaissance right up against their shores. And we probably need to back off a little because we're always 12 and 13 and 14 miles away. And that's international space. So in theory, we're legally allowed to be there. But the Chinese see it as fundamentally provocative. And Jim and I read that and we said, well, I'll speak for myself, not for Jim on this. Brzezinski is a little tougher of a guy than I am. He can probably deal with the arrows that are going to come at him in the American debate if he says we should actually pull back from doing this reconnaissance. I'm being a little facetious, although I'm sure he could deal with the arrows and the insults. But my view was we better not pull back. We've got to keep doing that reconnaissance. But is there a way to look for an opportunity to mitigate the Chinese anger? Well, the best idea Jim and I could come up with was what we call an open skies treaty. Actually, it is the open skies treaty that exists now between the former Warsaw Pact and NATO countries, which was developed at the end of the Cold War, and which is still in effect. And under this treaty, what happens is if Romania wants to fly over France, they send a démarche to Paris, and they say, we'd like to fly over these 4 military installations on this flight profile. What day can we do that? We're going to carry these sensors. And there's a certain amount of advance notice. So if the French have really, really good secrets they want to protect, they don't have to leave them out in the open the day the Romanians fly over. There's no big surprise about it. But still, the Romanians can get some feel for how many airplanes the French have and how many airplanes their factories might produce based on the size of the factory. Not all these countries have satellites like we do, so some of them need the aerial overflight to get this kind of information. Why not do the same thing with the Chinese? Why not say to the Chinese, let's do an open skies treaty between the US and China, and maybe even involve the Japanese and Koreans and others as well. And just an opportunity for China to feel like it has a little bit of access to our airspace. And you might recoil at the thought, but don't forget, the Russians have that right now. They have access to our airspace. They actually use it. They do these flights. But we always know where they are. And there's no surprises in this. So you might say, well, are the Chinese really going to find this all that important or helpful? I don't know. It may not be a big enough idea to really interest them, but it's a gesture, and it goes along with some of the other stuff. So we have a few more ideas on arms control too, but I'll leave it at that. Let me say just one word about military modernization and defense spending, and then I'll be done and we can talk and look forward to your comments and questions. As I said, the Chinese are now spending 150, 160 billion a year, maybe a little more on their military. We're spending about 600, but we're going down and they're coming up. So we humbly submit as two Americans to the Chinese that as they approach about half of our military spending level, they might want to consider slowing it down, slowing down their buildup. That may sound silly or preposterous or presumptuous that two Americans would make that suggestion or request to Chinese. After all, if they have a growing economy and we have a huge deficit, we're sort of asking them to lock in an American superiority at a time when the trend lines are in their favor, not in ours. And so we are realistic enough to know that the Chinese aren't going to accept a 2-to-1 American advantage forever. But we're suggesting to them that as they get to that 50% level, they might slow down a little because they might acknowledge that the way the world works today, we're protecting their oil for them. They may not enjoy that fact. Over time, they may want to change that fact. But right now, they get a lot of Persian Gulf oil that we're in the business of protecting with our Navy, which means we have a lot of our naval and other military forces in the broader Middle East region. They don't. They don't have to put their forces there. They can devote almost all their forces to the Western Pacific, and that's the other main place we operate. So for them, the Western Pacific is the one main theater of military activity and interest. For us, it's one of two. And that's a certain logic whereby we suggest that for the short term, it's actually for the Chinese, it should be adequate that they be in roughly the 50% range of our overall defense budget. But of course, that is somewhat self-serving, I would admit it. I'm going to try to make this argument in China in 2 weeks. We'll see how it goes over, because we're doing a book tour in Asia. So I would quickly add, and in China, I may begin with the next part and come back to the idea that I just mentioned to you last. But the idea that we might suggest is that right now the United States has this idea at the Pentagon called air-sea battle. And some of you, I'm sure, have heard of it. The Air Force and Navy got together and said, let's get a little bit more creative, let's get a little bit more joint, and let's try to respond to all these new dangerous technologies by integrating a lot of our defenses, a lot of our programs. And so they came up with this concept about 4 years ago with the help of a very good think tank in Washington called the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. And there are a lot of good ideas in air-sea battle, but there are some problems. One of them is the name. Air-sea battle is evocative of air-land battle, which is what NATO did vis-a-vis the Soviets in the 1970s and 1980s. We developed this new idea to try to get in the Soviets' face and be able to interdict their reinforcements if there were a war in Central Europe. It was justifiable, but it was in dealing with our #1 Cold War enemy. And now we're using the same kind of language to talk about a concept that certainly has China as its #1 focus. Now, if you had the Chief of Staff of the Air Force here, he would tell you, well, air-sea battle is not just about China. I agree. But it's motivated fundamentally by the shifts in military technology and power where China's leading the way globally. And so therefore, the Chinese see it as directed at them, and it's pretty hard to disagree that China's the main motivation. So we say, let's call it something a little bit less assertive. We call it air-sea operations, but it's not just a name change that we recommend. We also want to bring in the allies and even bring in the Chinese into some of our future maritime planning. Right now, the Chinese are helping us with the counter-piracy mission in the broader Middle East and the Gulf of Aden. And this is an opportunity to build on. We could try to do more joint planning and joint operations with the Chinese under this air-sea operations construct. There's still going to be we still have to do war planning. I get that. We still have to do certain things with just our allies, and we cannot invite the Chinese. But we should try to, if we're going to have a big new sexy idea like air-sea battle, we should, and it's going to be sort of the leading vanguard in our intellectual pursuit of new military capability, we shouldn't have it sound quite so hostile and quite so confrontational. So we should call it air-sea operations. We should include U.S. Army, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, U.S. allies, and we should include China where we can as well. Going beyond the name and the semantics and the inclusiveness, we should also be careful about talking too much about using air-sea battle as a guide for early preemption against Chinese targets on the mainland in the event of war. If you read some of the documents associated with this, including from the think tank I mentioned a minute ago, they favor rapid and early escalation, targeting all those Chinese missiles and submarines and airplanes that, if they were launched against our assets and our carriers and our bases, could do a lot of damage. And the logic here, the military logic, is understandable. That preemption is actually, and here I use preemption in the tactical military sense, getting the other guy before he launches. But that is a much safer way to operate than letting these advanced missiles be fired at you. So the Air Force and Navy at a tactical level are correct, or the people at CSBA who have proposed this are correct. But in a broader sense, it has very great escalatory potential. The minute you have a skirmish, there's a temptation to want to escalate and do this preemption. Just like the minute World War I broke out, the Schlieffen Plan told you you had to quickly escalate if you were German, because your only hope was to pull off this quick defeat of France and then pivot to the east. And if you didn't do that, you would lose. And our logic of this air-sea construct is not that bad. It's not that dangerous. I don't want to overdo my argument. But it does have some echoes of the Schlieffen Plan, or at least of a logic that says rapid preemption is necessary the minute you get into a fight. And that's going to produce some dangerous escalatory pressures on both sides. So we try to argue against that and have some military logic and some alternative military approaches focused largely on resilience and hardening and other things that would allow us to hopefully be a little less in need of an immediate escalation of that type. So we worked through a lot of arguments like this. Where we wind up is that we acknowledge it's only going to work if both sides do it. The Chinese got to help. They got to be part of this. And it's going to be a process. It's not a one-time thing. You don't sit down in a big negotiation and sign the piece of paper and all 20 things are put into effect. Some of our ideas are probably in need of refinement. There might be other ideas that need to be brought into the mix. But the overall thrust of this kind of an effort to reassure each other, even as we stay resolute in defense of our core interests and allies, is, I think, the only way forward. So thank you for your patience. Sorry to go a little long. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. I'm going to have you call on everybody.
Okay.
And just repeat the questions, if you
Great.
would, for the camera.
What's the Russia angle here? To what extent should we try to deal with the crisis in Ukraine and wonder about its implications for East Asia? I'm assuming is part of what's on your mind. Of course, the Russians also have an Asian presence, but it's a very small Asian presence at this point. I think they're a second-tier player. But the Ukraine issue is obviously top tier in international visibility and salience. And I think a lot of our allies are wondering, it's sort of the opposite perspective of what we just heard the gentleman in the back talk about, wondering what does it mean for them to watch Russia be able to get away with this? And I would say a couple of things in response. First of all, Russia didn't exactly get away with this. And if Putin keeps it up, we may not prevent him from taking part of Ukraine, but he's going to have made a choice. To get a little bit of Ukraine, he's going to sacrifice Russian economic growth for the rest of his presidency, because we are good enough at sanctions that we may not drive them back to the Stone Age, but we're going to be able to put them to zero GDP growth, I think. And Russia's not going to have the kind of engagement with the world economy that it needs. And that will be a very strong message to Putin, his successors, and the Chinese, and anybody else who would do this sort of thing, that there's a big price to be paid. Secondly, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And on this point, I will agree with my friend from a few minutes ago who said that the U.S. shouldn't be the world's policeman. We have to make Putin pay a price. We have to try to prevent any further escalation of the Ukraine problem. But it is not our problem to undo. I don't think America has the realistic means to actually get Crimea back for the Ukrainians. And I don't think our East Asian allies expect it, because they know Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Now, if we just ignored the problem altogether, I think they would worry about that. But as we're ratcheting up the sanctions, and we're prepared, I think, to do much more serious things if Russia moves into eastern Ukraine with large army formations. I think people are watching, and I think they're generally finding that a viable approach. Merkel and Obama are going to meet tomorrow. I hope one of the takeaways will be that Putin will hear the two most important countries in this whole thing, Germany and the US, lock arms on the likelihood of intensified sanctions if he escalates further. That's a very important message, not only for Ukraine, not only for Europe, but even for East Asia. A couple of things. You raise a lot of good points. But I would say that with respect, your second and third points are in conflict because you want us to do more about cyber but not police the world. See, this is the dilemma. When you get into this kind of a problem, these problems don't solve themselves without American activity, engagement. Well, let me just finish. Your question was very well posed. I'm trying to take it seriously. And you may not agree with my answer. My point is that if you say, on the one hand, we need to do more about Chinese cyber incursions. On the other hand, we got to stop policing the world. Those are both understandable sentiments, but they pull you in opposite directions because the first one says we need American pressure on China in order to get them to behave better. And the second one says, but no, we don't really want to police the domain, the world, what have you. So the book is an effort to recognize that there are a lot of these kinds of conflicting, if not contradictory incentives that we face. And we're going to have to find a way to do something like option 3, not option 1 or 2. You can't just appease. You can't just outcompete. You've got to look for where you need to be resolute and where you can reassure. On your point about your grandchildren, or my daughters for that matter, I agree with your point. I don't want to fight over the Senkaku Islands either. And I think that if the Chinese were to take one, if the Chinese were to, take one overnight tonight, and we wake up tomorrow and one of them's taken, I don't believe that the most logical American response is necessarily to seize the island back. And in fact, the book doesn't take a strong position on that kind of a hypothetical, but it does point out we have other options to consider. A quarantine. If you're going to do something military, you might want to do a quarantine, not a counter-invasion. Or even the kind of economic sanctions that we're now preparing should Vladimir Putin move into eastern Ukraine. We're getting better at sanctions. The last thing I did today was go to a meeting on some of the new sanction tools that we've developed over the years. And so you might consider something like that. But the problem is if you just decide you don't want your grandkids to fight over that and therefore you let it happen and you don't do anything about it, what do the Chinese take away as the story, as the message, and what do they do next? So we have to be a little bit careful. We need a firm response, even if we don't necessarily want to send your grandkids or my kids.
Normally at this point I would apologize for ending the evening when people still have questions, but tonight there's a solution for that. The book that's on sale has an absolutely marvelous description of the general theoretical questions. It raises a wide array of the problems that confront us and a lot of practical answers. So if you want to continue to think about these things, the book's on sale. Thanks very much, Mike.